Hi, I'm going to read Mr. Small by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Small was very small, probably the smallest person you'd ever seen in your whole life. Or perhaps the smallest person you never seen in your whole life, because he was so small you probably wouldn't be able to see him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big, so perhaps we should say Mr. Small was as small as a pin. That is very tiny. Mr. Small lived in a small house underneath a daisy. This is a pretty daisy. At the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. It was a very nice house, although very tiny, and it suited Mr. Tiny very well indeed. He liked living there. Now, this is a story about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of job could Mr. Small do? After all, there aren't many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, and he hadn't had any ideas. Not one. He was thinking about it now while he was having his lunch, and he was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought while he was eating his big lunch, but it was no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself. After lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice. So after lunch, he left his house and walked to Mr. Robinson's house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling very out of breath. Oh, poor Mr. Small. A worm crawled by and stopped. Good afternoon, Mr. Small, said the worm. Good afternoon, Walter, said Mr. Small to the worm, whom he knew quite well. Out for a walk, are you? asked Walter. Going to see Mr. Robinson, replied Mr. Small. Oh, said Walter. About a job? added Mr. Small. Oh, said Walter the worm again, and crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he'd rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked all the rest of the way to Mr. Robinson's house without stopping once. When he got there, he climbed up the steps to Mr. Robinson's back door. He knocked at the door, and nobody heard him. He knocked again at the door. Nobody heard him. The trouble was, you see, if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. Poor Mr. Small. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was a doorbell. How can I ring the doorbell when I can't reach it? Thought Mr. Small to himself. He climbed up the wall, brick by brick, to reach the bell. He climbed up 4 bricks when he made the mistake of looking down. Oh dear, he fell. Bang! Ouch, said Mr. Small, rubbing his head. Oh, poor Mr. Small. Just then, Mr. Small heard some footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. Hello, said the voice. The postman looked down. Hello, he said to Mr. Small. Who are you? I'm Mr. Small, said Mr. Small. Will you ring the doorbell for me? Of course I will, replied the postman in answer to Mr. Small's question, and reaching out he pressed the doorbell with his finger. Thank you, said Mr. Small. My pleasure, said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard footsteps coming to the door, and the door opened. Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. That's funny, he said. I'm sure I heard somebody ringing the doorbell. He was about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. Hello, said the little voice. Hello, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson looked down and down. Hello, he said. What are you doing here? I've come to ask your advice, said Mr. Small to Mr. Robinson. Well, can you see how tiny he is on Mr. Robinson's armchair? "Well," said Mr. Robinson, "you better come in and have a talk." Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson into the house and perched on one of the arms of Mr. Robinson's favourite chairs. He told him how he couldn't think of a job that he could do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of tea and listened. "So you see," Mr. Small explained, "how difficult it is." "Yes, I can see that," said Mr. Robinson, "but leave it to me." Mr. Robinson knew lots of people. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a restaurant and arranged for Mr. Small to work there. Ooh, he's covered in custard. It's actually covered in mustard. Putting mustard into mustard pots. But Mr. Small kept falling into the pots and getting covered in mustard. Ow! So he left that job. Poor Mr. Small. That must have been a tricky job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a sweet shop. Now that would be a great job. And arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving sweets. But Mr. Small kept falling into the jam jar. Oh dear, poor Mr. Small, can you see? He's fallen in and he's got stuck. So he had to leave that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a place where matches were made and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into a box. But Mr. Small kept getting shot in the box with the matches. Oh no, so he left. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked at a farm and he arranged for Mr. Small to work there, sorting out the brown eggs from the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he had to leave that job as well. Oh dear. Can you see how small he is next to all the little eggs? "What are we going to do with you?" said Mr. Robinson to Mr. Small one evening. I don't know, said Mr. Small in a very small voice. "I've got one more idea," said Mr. Robinson. "I know somebody who writes children's books. Perhaps you would like to go and work for him." That's a nice idea. So the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. "Can I work for you, Mr. Small?" asked the man. "Yes, you can," replied the man. "Pass me the pencil and tell me about the jobs that you've been doing. Then I'll write a book about it. I'll call it Mr. Small." "But the children won't want to read a book about me," said Mr. Small. "Oh, yes, they will," said the man. "They will like it very much." And so did you, didn't you? I did too. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.